We spent $47 million building a replica of an Anasazi cliff dwelling at Mesa Verde National Park. Hired the best archaeologists, the finest stonemasons, used historically accurate sandstone blocks weighing up to 800 pounds each, even mixed the mortar using the exact 3-to-1 ratio of clay to sand that the original builders used around 1190 AD. We wanted visitors to understand how these people lived, to walk through their rooms, to feel the weight of their architectural genius. But here's what we didn't account for. Within 18 months, the replica started falling apart. Cracks appeared in the mortar joints. Stones shifted. The Park Service had to close it for safety reasons. Meanwhile, 200 feet away, the original Anasazi structures, built over 800 years ago, with nothing but stone tools and human hands, are still standing, still solid, still defying our understanding of structural engineering. We failed because we forgot one critical thing. The Anasazi didn't just build structures, they built relationships with the material, with the cliff face, with the microclimate of each alcove. They understood something about long-term structural integrity that our modern engineering couldn't capture in $47 million of careful reconstruction. And then, at the height of their architectural achievement, at the peak of a civilization that had flourished for over 700 years, they vanished. Not slowly, not gradually. Within a single generation, between roughly 1275 and 1300 AD, tens of thousands of people abandoned the most sophisticated architectural complexes in North America, walked away from multi-story apartment buildings that had taken generations to construct, left behind thousands of perfectly functional rooms, and disappeared into the desert. This is the story of the Anasazi, and it's not about aliens or mysteries or unsolved riddles. It's about what happens when a civilization optimizes so perfectly for one set of conditions that they engineer themselves into a corner they can't escape from. It's about the danger of technical mastery without adaptive flexibility. It's about the psychology of sunk costs at a civilizational scale. Let me start by describing what they built, because you need to understand the scale of achievement before you can grasp the scale of the abandonment. Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. Construction began around 850 AD. The first scientist called the bastions. At its peak in 1100 AD, it was the largest building in North America, a distinction it would hold until the 1880s. Nearly 800 years later, the structure contains over 600 rooms and 40 ceremonial chambers called kivas. It rises 4 stories in places. The walls, made of core and veneer masonry, use precisely cut sandstone blocks on the exterior faces, with rubble fill in between, a technique that distributes load efficiently while minimizing material use. Here's the technical detail that should make you pause. The load-bearing walls at ground level are over 3 feet thick. The sandstone blocks, quarried from cliffs up to 50 miles away, weigh between 200 and 800 pounds each. Each block was shaped using nothing but harder stone tools, primarily quartzite hammers. Surfaces were pecked and ground to create flat-bearing surfaces that mate so precisely that in many areas you can't slip a knife blade between the joints. The mortar, analyzed using petrographic thin section analysis in the 1980s, consists of a clay-sand mixture with specific ratios that vary by location within the structure. Ground floor exterior walls use a 3-to-1 sand-to-clay ratio for strength. Interior partition walls use a 1-to-1 ratio for workability. Upper floor walls use a 2-to-1 ratio, balancing strength with reduced weight. This isn't random. This is materials engineering. But here's where it gets psychologically interesting. The effort required to build Pueblo Bonito has been calculated by architectural historians at the University of New Mexico. Quarrying and transporting the estimated 200,000 sandstone blocks would have required roughly 800,000 person-hours of labor. Shaping those blocks, another 300,000 hours. Construction, assembly, and finishing, another 500,000 hours. We're talking about a minimum of 1.6 million person-hours of coordinated labor spread over 250 years of continuous construction. That's not just building, that's commitment. At a scale that borders on the pathological, that's what psychologists call escalation of commitment, the tendency to continue investing in a project because of the cumulative resources already invested, even when conditions change and the project no longer makes rational sense. Because here's the thing about Chaco Canyon. It's a terrible place to build a city. It's at an elevation of 6,200 feet in a high desert that receives less than 9 inches of rain per year. Summer temperatures exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Winter temperatures drop below zero. The growing season is barely 120 days. The soil is alkaline and nutrient poor. There are no permanent water sources in the immediate canyon. The nearest reliable springs are over 6 miles away. Every calorie of food, every drop of water, every piece of timber used in construction had to be imported through human labor. The roof beams alone, over 200,000 ponderosa pine and fir logs averaging 16 feet in length and weighing 150 pounds each, were carried from forests 50 to 70 miles away, not dragged, carried. Because the Anasazi didn't have wheeled vehicles or beasts of burden. So why build there? Why commit multiple generations to constructing monumental architecture in a location that's fundamentally hostile to human habitation? The answer lies in what archaeologists call the Chaco phenomenon, a religious and economic system that emerged around 1850 and peaked between 1020 and 1110 AD. Chaco wasn't a city in the conventional sense. It was a ceremonial center, a pilgrimage site, a redistribution hub for a regional network that covered over 60,000 square miles of the Four Corners region. The evidence for this is architectural and astronomical. Pueblo Bonito and other great houses in Chaco Canyon are precisely aligned to solar and lunar events. The main axis of Pueblo Bonito aligns to within 1 degree of true north-south. Certain windows and doorways frame the sunrise on the summer and winter solstices. Spiral petroglyphs on Fajada Butte interact with shadow patterns to mark the solstices and equinoxes with precision. This wasn't accidental. This was intentional, astronomical architecture, designed to mark ritual calendar events. The Anasazi had developed what cognitive archaeologists call monumental timekeeping, using architecture itself as a ceremonial clock, but it went deeper than astronomy. Chemical analysis of residues in pottery found at Chaco shows that cacao, scarlet macaws, and turquoise ornaments were being imported from Mesoamerica over 1,200 miles to the south. Cylinder jars, a specific ceramic form associated with chocolate consumption in Mayan culture, appear in elite contexts at Chaco. This means the Anasazi had established trade networks spanning the distance from New Mexico to central Mexico, crossing some of the most difficult terrain in North America. The roads they built to support this network are staggering. Using aerial photography and ground-penetrating radar, archaeologists have mapped over 400 miles of engineered roads radiating from Chaco Canyon. These aren't paths. These are constructed roadways, averaging 30 feet wide, cut through bedrock in some places, elevated on berms in others, maintained dead straight across difficult terrain using line-of-sight surveying techniques. One road segment runs perfectly straight for 60 miles. 60 miles without deviation, crossing mesas, descending into canyons, climbing back out. maintaining a consistent width and grade. The engineering required to survey and construct that, using only visual sighting and human labor, represents a level of organizational capacity and technical skill that rivals anything built in medieval Europe at the same time. So here's the psychological trap they built for themselves. The Chaco system worked brilliantly for about 250 years. The great houses served as redistribution centers, collecting surplus corn from outlying communities during good years and redistributing it during bad years. The ritual calendar synchronized economic activity across a vast region. The road network facilitated movement of goods and people. The astronomical alignments reinforced the authority of the priestly elite who could predict celestial events. It was a perfect system, optimized, efficient, magnificent, and completely inflexible. Because the whole thing depended on one critical assumption: that the climate would remain stable, that the summer monsoons would continue to deliver enough rainfall to grow corn, that the winter snowpack in the mountains would continue to feed the springs and seeps that provided water. And then, around 1130 AD, we know this from dendrochronology, the analysis of tree rings. The Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona has compiled a continuous tree ring record for the Southwest, going back over 2,000 years. The data is unambiguous. Between 1130 and 1180 AD, the region experienced a 50-year drought, the most severe in over 1,000 years. Annual precipitation dropped by approximately 30 to 40%. The summer monsoons, which normally deliver 60 to 70% of annual rainfall, became erratic and unreliable. For a population that had optimized their entire agricultural system around maize cultivation, this was catastrophic. Maize requires consistent moisture during a narrow window in the growing season. Too little rain, and the crop fails. The timing of rain matters as much as the total amount. The Anasazi had developed sophisticated water management techniques, building check dams, terraces, and bordered gardens to capture and concentrate runoff. But those techniques were designed for normal climate variability, not for a multi-decade drought. The archaeological evidence for what happened next is brutal. Skeletal analysis of burials from this period shows increased rates of parodic hyperostosis and cribra orbidalia, bone lesions associated with iron deficiency anemia caused by malnutrition. Based on this, linear enamel hypoplasias, defects in tooth enamel caused by childhood nutritional stress, spike dramatically. Average adult height decreases and infant mortality increases. But here's the really disturbing part. Construction at Chaco doesn't stop immediately. In fact, some of the most elaborate building happens during the early decades of the drought. Between 1130 and 1150, multiple new great houses are constructed in outlying areas. Existing structures in Chaco Canyon continue to be maintained and modified. This is cognitive dissonance at a civilizational scale. The evidence that the system is failing is all around them. People are malnourished. Crops are failing. But the institutional momentum is so powerful, the sunk costs are so enormous that the society doubles down on the strategies that worked in the past. They build more ceremonial architecture. They invest more labor in ritual activities. They pray harder. It doesn't work. By 1150, construction at Chaco has stopped, not reduced. Stopped. The ceremonial center that had been continuously built and rebuilt for 300 years goes silent, but the population doesn't leave immediately. This is important. The abandonment isn't a panicked flight, it's a slow unraveling. People start moving to areas with more reliable water sources. Small settlements along the Rio Grande and its tributaries see population increases. Some groups move north into what's now southern Colorado. And here's where the architecture becomes even more interesting, because it reveals the psychology of a civilization in crisis. Around 1150, the Anasazi start building cliff dwellings, not at ground level, not on mesa tops where construction is easier. They start building multi-story apartment complexes in natural alcoves in sheer cliff faces, sometimes hundreds of feet above the canyon floor, accessible only by hand and toe-hold trails carved into the rock face or by removable ladders. Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde, constructed between 1190 and 1260 AD, contains 150 rooms and 23 kivas, housing an estimated 100 people. It's built into a massive alcove in the cliff face, protected from above by the overhanging rock. The walls are made of shaped sandstone blocks set in clay mortar. The rooms are small, averaging 6 feet by 8 feet, with ceilings barely 6 feet high. Many rooms have no ground-level access, requiring residents to climb up through roof hatches using internal ladders. From an engineering perspective, building in these locations is insane. Every stone, every piece of timber, every handful of mortar has to be carried up near vertical cliff faces. Water has to be hauled up from springs in the canyon bottom. There's no room for agriculture. The fields are on the mesa tops, requiring daily climbs of hundreds of vertical feet. The effort to benefit ratio is catastrophically poor. So why do it? The traditional archaeological interpretation was defense. The cliff dwellings are fortified. They're difficult to approach. They're positioned to be defensible. This must mean the Anasazi were under threat, probably from nomadic raiders. But recent analysis suggests something more psychologically complex. Skeletal evidence from this period shows increased rates of traumatic injury, but the pattern isn't consistent with external warfare. It's consistent with internal violence, interpersonal conflict, resource competition within Anasazi society itself. The cliff dwellings aren't fortresses against external enemies. They're refuges from each other. This is what happens when a tightly integrated social system starts to fragment under resource stress. The ceremonial authority that held the Chaco network together has collapsed. The redistribution system that buffered against local crop failures no longer functions. Communities are on their own, and when resources become scarce, the psychology shifts from cooperation to competition. There's archaeological evidence of violence from this period that's deeply disturbing. At Cowboy Wash in southwestern Colorado, excavations in the 90s uncovered remains showing clear evidence of cannibalism. Not ritual cannibalism, survival cannibalism. Cut marks on bones consistent with defleshing. Long bones broken to extract marrow. Skulls crushed to access brain tissue. Chemical analysis of residues in cooking pots shows human myoglobin, a protein specific to human muscle tissue. This is what psychologists call moral injury, the psychological damage that comes from being forced by circumstances to violate your own ethical framework. The Anasazi weren't monsters. They were humans pushed beyond the limits of their cultural resilience by a combination of environmental catastrophe and systemic inflexibility. The drought that started in 1130 eased somewhat in the 1180s. For about 40 years, conditions improved. Rainfall increased. The tree ring record shows a period of relative stability. And during this window, there's a final pulse of construction at Mesa Verde and other northern sites. New cliff dwellings are built. Existing structures are expanded. It looks, briefly, like recovery. And then the bottom falls out. Around 1276, the worst drought in the entire tree ring record begins. It lasts 20 to 3 years. From 1276 to 1299, annual precipitation averages less than 70% of normal. The summer monsoons fail repeatedly. The winter snowpack is minimal. Springs dry up. Streams stop flowing. The archaeological term for this period is the Great Drought, and it's not hyperbole. By 1300, the Four Corners region is empty, not depopulated. Empty. Every major settlement has been abandoned. Mesa Verde, Canyon de Chelly, Cayenta, Hovenweep, all deserted. Tens of thousands of people, representing 700 years of continuous cultural development, have left. Where did they go? This isn't actually a mystery. We know where they went. The descendants of the Anasazi are the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona. The Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, the Pueblos along the Rio Grande. Their oral traditions explicitly state that they migrated from the north. Linguistic analysis confirms the connection. Pottery styles show clear continuity. The Anasazi didn't disappear. They moved. They adapted. They survived, but they left behind everything they had built. All that monumental architecture, all that engineering genius, all those millions of person-hours of invested labor. They walked away because staying would have meant death. This is the psychology of sunk costs at a civilizational level. The rational decision made decades earlier would have been to diversify their settlement pattern, to maintain smaller, more mobile communities, to avoid the kind of centralized specialization that made them so vulnerable to climate change. But by the time the crisis became undeniable, they had invested so much in the Chaco system, in the great houses, in the ceremonial infrastructure, that changing course felt impossible, until it became necessary. And then they did change, radically and quickly. They abandoned the architectural tradition that had defined them for centuries. They shifted to new settlement patterns, new social organizations, new economic strategies.